My name is Gary Rutkowski. Today is July 13th, 2000. We're in Beverly Hills, California, interviewing writer, director, producer Leonard Stern. Okay, let's start with your background information. First of all, what was your name at birth?
I'm trying to remember. I don't think I ever saw the certificate. Leonard Bernard Stern.
Okay, and when were you born?
In what year? 1922, December 23rd.
And where were you born?
In New York City.
Is that where you grew up?
To the best of my knowledge, yes. Yeah.
And let's talk a little bit about your parents. What was your father's name?
My father's name was Max, short for Maximilian, and my mother's name was Esther.
And what did your father do?
My father was an auctioneer and then became a city marshal.
And did your mother work?
No, my mother never worked, to my knowledge.
Did you have brothers or sisters?
No,
You were an
no.
only child?
I think so, yes.
Okay. And what were your hobbies growing up?
Well, I did all the sports that were available to one in New York City, which of course included stickball, which is indigenous to the area. And my main interest was reading and writing, almost from my first conscious moment.
Were you a good student?
I was a good student when I wanted to be a good student. I got very involved in extracurricular work, and I enjoyed at school, and I enjoyed that immensely. And I owe a great deal of indebtedness to a number of teachers I had in junior high school and in high school.
And the stuff you were writing, was it comedy material?
Yes. Strange enough, I've thought about that a great deal. Why was I writing comedy at age 14, 15, 16, 17? Why did I know what the structure of a joke was? And I finally came to the conclusion that I was a product of radio. And I spoke to many of my peers who are comedy writers, and we kind of agree that you listen on radio to Fred Allen, to Jack Benny, to Milton Berle, to Burns and Allen, and you started to understand the cadence and rhythm of a joke. Consciously or not, it became almost a daily lesson. And I think this explains why some of us who grew up in California, some of us grew up in Texas, others in North Dakota, and many of us in New York, all could write the same joke or a reasonable facsimile thereof. So I think we became, and maybe radio is responsible for some of the best comedy writers extant, we became students of the medium, and we collaborate. Radio forced you to collaborate, if you remember. You didn't know what the person who was talking to you looked like, so you created your own character. Then you created the ambiance as well. And I remember what Jack Benny, my version of his Maxwell, my version of his safe that was in the bowels of his home were destroyed by what they presented when he went to television. Those were the wrong image.
Now, were you writing stories as a teenager, or were you writing gags?
I wrote a plotted, pardon me, that's a tough thing to say, plotted pieces. Pick, pepple, yeah, the P problem. I wrote storylines. When I was 14, I did the school play in the junior high school, and it was a spoof of a magician show, but it had a beginning, a middle, and an end. I've been very respectful of that throughout my whole career. And in high school, I wrote the equivalent of what would be a college varsity show, and they were all story structured. And I was thinking about that the other day, and I remembered one joke I wrote in a political satire, my third high school show. And the Russian ambassador was proclaiming the greatness of their agricultural program. And he said to an American senator, on our farms, we grow strawberries this big. And the senator said, do you put fertilizer on them? He said, no, just sugar and cream. So there was that structure, yeah.
What high school did you attend?
DeWitt Clinton High School.
So you did a number of these shows?
3. and they were enormous casts. They were all musicals. The chorus was about 40 voices. The orchestra was 65 pieces, and never again to be duplicated professionally. Couldn't afford to have that kind of significant force out there performing and singing and playing.
So did you knew that this is what you wanted to do when you grew up?
Yeah, I had no other thought of any other profession or occupation. Spy entered my mind once in a while. Yeah, but there wasn't a market for it then. You had to wait for a war. One came along pretty soon.
Yeah. Speaking of that, did you serve during World War II?
I think so, yes.
And where were you?
I was in a number of places. I served with the Air Force and then the Army. For one while, I was in charge of WAC recruiting in the 3rd Service Command, a job that I never could have anticipated. In fact, when I first entered the Army, there wasn't any Women's Army Corps. And then I became the public relations officer and headed up the drive to get more WAC medical technicians and created a campaign called Blue Angels for Purple Hearts. In retrospect, it doesn't hold up. And then I became a public relations officer, and I was assigned to write recruiting programs in which the Army would insert a commercial, but I was free to write whatever I pleased. And they would supply name personalities. I did comedies with Milton Berle. I did drama with Edmund Gwenn, Joe McRae, Ray Milland. It was marvelous on-the-job training. I did about 50 programs.
This is for radio?
For radio, yes.
How did they air?
They aired them, I syndicated them across the country, and then they put in the Army commercial. They had a commercial in the front and the back, 2 one-minute commercials, and then they did a lead-in and a sign-off.
Would you meet the personalities who were?
Oh, yes. They all either were in Washington or Baltimore. We were recorded in both places. And they were either appearing in plays or on personal tour, or they were in the Army and they were assigned to the project. Arthur Lawrence, the playwright, was doing the same work in New York. And so both of us benefited greatly from this freedom of creative expression.
Was it mostly comedy you were writing?
And not then. I only did comedy when I had a comedy performer. I had the Ritz Brothers in one show and Milton Berle in another, so both of those, of course, were comedy.
So you were writing things specifically for these talents?
Yeah, well, I knew who our guest would be. I would then write, say Helen Hayes was a guest, and I created a character similar to Miss Marple, so I made it a mystery program. They didn't care. That's why I said it was just get it done and get it out there, and make sure the performers were happy. And generally they were. They're very helpful.
Now, didn't you have an earlier association with Milton Berle?
Milton Berle gave me my first job. I was hired, I submitted material to Milton, a series of one-liners. Marty Ragaway, with whom I collaborated throughout my early career, had worked for Milton's press agent, Doug Whitney. And Doug Whitney said, if you guys write some material for Milton, I'll get it to him. And we did do that. And then Milton asked to see us, and we were very hopeful. And the very first thing he said to us is, you two are older than you look. And we didn't quite know what that meant. And he said, this first joke is about 100 years old. And we were chagrined to us that we had written it. But he liked the material, and he did hire us to write special material for him. And then he asked me to travel with him. And I would write jokes that fit whatever place he was playing. They take advantage of the city, the ambience. And he was a marvelous mentor. And Milton was probably the most respectful comedian as regards writers. He was prideful about having good writers. Most comedians in those days hated the dependency upon writers, so they seldom hired one or two. They hired a clump, and that way they could have a feeling of independence. They weren't beholden to any one individual. And as a consequence, writers were generally referred to as the boys, the guys, the gang. And even when you worked with comedians who didn't have a large staff, they somehow finessed your name. They would call you, "Hey kid," "Hello pal." And in one case, I was called by one comedian, "Hi neighbor," and the other said, "Hello Tootsie." And the only way I could introduce my mother, who came to the set at that time, was Abbott and Costello. And I introduced Lou Costello to my mother by saying, "Lou, I want you to meet Mrs. Tootsie." He actually turned out to be a very good soul, but in that time, that subtle war was in existence.
So when you said that you were writing special material for Milton Berle, these were all personal appearances?
Yes. He didn't. He had yet to happen in radio or television. He had some minor skirmishes with radio, but he was in Broadway plays then primarily. He was in a play called Springtime in Brazil, and you're not allowed to change any dialogue. The playwright is the most prestigious person involved, and his words are sacred. So Milton didn't like a lot of the script, so we wrote ad-libs continuously for him. And there was never anything on paper.
So getting back to radio, after the war, what did you...
After the war, Marty Raggaway had not been in the service, and he was one of the few comedy writers available, so he had a monopoly on New York City. And he was our contact for working at NBC. And NBC was developing a program for a comedian named Jimmy Edmondson. Jimmy Edmondson's professional name, when he appeared in clubs, was Professor Backwards. And his skill was writing words backwards on a blackboard. Why you would develop a radio show for him, I can't quite figure out. It's the equivalent of having a one-arm paper hanger. But we did, and he did have a unique speech pattern. And he was Southern, so we did set it in the South. And nothing ever happened with Jimmy on radio, but everyone else who supported him in that show went on to gain fame. Nanette Fabray, the Ames brothers, Ed Begley.
So what kinds of things did you end up writing for that show?
Oh, we did a book show. We set it, I can't remember, but I think it was in the Southern Mansion, and he was trying to survive antebellum, and make things happen. And of course, he was always fighting up against insurmountable odds. And somehow that led into a song. Don't ask me how now, or two.
So it's sort of a variety format?
A variety format within with some parameters, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And following that, did you work on another radio show?
Oh, pardon me, yes. At the same time, simultaneously, we were doing the $64 question, which was hosted by Phil Baker. And $64 then was a considerable amount of money. And I remember audiences cautioning people not to go for the $64, keep the $32, don't put yourself at risk. And it was that show, which was very popular, that took us to California. Phil was a native Californian by then and didn't want to live in New York. So the last season of the show we did in California.
So approximately what year was the move to California?
Then about 47, 48.
And when you say you wrote for the $64,000 question?
Well, you ad-libs for the host, clever responses. And that's still done. Mm-hmm. Yeah, very few people. Improvisational comedy is generally quasi-improvisational. I think there's a subtle difference between improvisation and extemporaneous. I think it falls closer to extemporaneous, which implies, I do believe, some work has been done on it.
So when you moved to California, then what did you do next?
Well, California, we were looking for work in radio, and Marty and I were hired to work with Abe Burrows on the Dinah Shore radio program, and we were the two writers in the closet. We weren't invited to rehearsals, and we only met with Abe. And Abe was a man of unusual hours as well as personality. And sometimes we get a call, and at 12 o'clock at night, we'd report to his home. And I remember Abe working in a turtleneck sweater always, and behind a wooden desk. And he always made me feel I was reporting to a U-boat commander. And we would write material. Peter Lynn Hayes was the comic on the Dinah Shore show. We'd write material for Peter Lynn Hayes, which he never performed. And so we became increasingly discouraged. And Abe said, the material is good. I just can't sell it to them, but it's good material. And he confirmed his belief, because when he started to do his own act, he used our material. And so we had a delayed redemption. Yes. And then we heard, and our agent told us, Cy Fisher, that Abbott and Costello, who had a weekly radio program, were looking for new writers. And he had submitted us, and they were interested, and we met with them, and they hired us.
Can you describe that first meeting them?
Yes, it was most assuredly. I've forgotten until this very moment. We went to Lou Costello's office, which was on Sunset Boulevard, and had just been newly decorated. And I remembered, I realized that all the books were green, which conformed, the covers of all the books conformed to the design and color coordination of the room. And he said, I'm sorry, I have to excuse myself, but my bodyguard is looking for Bud's bodyguard, and they're out to kill each other. And so we'll have this meeting as soon as I get back, if I get back. And we left. At that time, each of them had a bodyguard to protect them. And the two bodyguards had gotten in a fight and gone home for their guns. And so it was, I have to say, it's indelibly etched, but requires some recall. I must have wanted to block it out of my memory. Anyway, he came back, and by then we had found the green books were, we had taken the liberty of removing from our show, were classics. The designer just covered them with green bound leather. We started with that show, and the show was virtually divided in half. The first half of the show was standard vaudeville routines they recreated. And then we were to do the new part of the show, and it became increasingly difficult to just start a storyline, have 12 minutes in which to end it. So we started to do elaborate sketches, which didn't require as much of a storyline. And we did one which was a spoof of Sam Spade. Radio at that time, you could use almost a monosyllabic voice over technique. I came into the office. I crossed to my desk. And I sat down in the chair and thought. And so we did that for Lou Costello as Sam Spade, and we'd use sound effects. I remember one thing. I sat down in the chair. I threw my feet up on the desk. There was a crash. He said, I missed. And he fell in love with that character. And for the rest of that season, that's all we did was Sam Spade routines. One of the great advantages of that show was meeting Norman Abbott, who's a lifelong friend, who was Bud's nephew, and also had as his friends the Dead End Kids. And so we became very close with Gabe Dow and Hunt Hall of the five, and Norman.
So who were the Dead End Kids in case?
Who they were, Leo Gore, and who they were, okay, the Dead End Kids appeared in a play written by Sidney Kingsley that was on Broadway. It was a huge hit, and they were brought to California to recreate their roles, and they did it with Humphrey Bogart, the original production, and there was such a tremendous success that they appeared then in movies with James Cagney and other Warner Brothers stars. They influenced Hollywood tremendously. People were interested in their vitality, and they brought to even though they were trained actors, they brought a natural feeling to their roles. They seemed to be the people they were, off the screen as well as on the screen. And many well-known directors would hang out with them. They loved to go riding on motorcycles. The kids did everything that would endanger them. If it was a challenge, they wanted to do it. And then eventually they left the Dead End Kids, and they went to Monogram, where they made a series of movies over 5 years, which were called the Bowery Boy movies. They were low-budget movies. At the same time, a whole other group was doing the East Side Kids. It's very interesting to know who was involved in the East Side Kids. One of my friends, Carl Foreman, was writing them then, and Sidney Lumet was an East Side Kid. So it was an interesting time in California in the movie making. None of those movies ever went over 6 days or cost more than $70,000.
So getting back to, you were writing the Abbott and Costello show. Your partner was Martin Ragaway.
Right.
How did you guys write together? If I walked into a room and you guys were working, how would it look?
Well, we would sit in the same room, and I guess the right expression would be sweat out a story. We'd have a notion that they'd be marvelous if they were in the Foreign Legion. But then how to get them there, how to justify it. Once we had the plot, which took most of the time, the thinking time, and we detailed it so that we had both a story outline and a step outline of each breakdown of each scene. And then we'd write it. And the writing took infinitely less time than creating the story. We went from radio with Abbott and Costello to doing a rewrite on one of their movies. They wanted us to do it and give it some jokes, additional jokes. And we did that. It was called Africa Screams. And our credit on that movie was additional dialogue. That's a credit that disappeared, and I think it was a poor decision to eliminate it, because I think it most aptly describes what most writers are doing today when they are hired to rewrite a screenplay. They're adding dialogue generally.
So Africa Screams was your first screen credit?
Right. Mm-hmm.
And do you remember some of the stuff?
No, I only remember that one of the Three Stooges, Shemp Howard, was in that. And that fascinated me, and we were really there as spectators more than contributors once we did the jokes. And again, we were just the writers, the boys, hi neighbor, hello Tootsie. So we didn't impact on them at all in those days. And of course, we were in awe of being in the location in which we were.
So it was Abbott who called you neighbor?
Yes, and Lou called me Tootsie. They eventually got to know our names. And it was very interesting. Abbott and Costello had a senior writer or somebody who I guess had tenure named John Grant, who I do believe wrote the Who's On First routine, which to me is a remarkable piece of material to have the conviction that this would work when it's such an enormous contrivance, and the fact that it does work, and when they were timed it impeccably, it was hilarious. In fact, there's a very interesting experience available to you if you want to have it. They did the same routine twice in movies. They did it in Buck Privates, their very first movie, and then they repeated it in about the 10th or 12th movie. The second movie, the director wanted to make it different, and he utterly destroyed the routine because he made cuts, and you can't. That routine is dependent on overlapping and interruptions, and so you see how you can emasculate an infallible piece of material.
Now, would they do the Who's On First in the radio show every so often?
By popular request or when the writing was poor, yes. Now, now we want to go on from Abbott and Costello, right?
Well, before we
Oh,
do,
yes.
you wrote a couple of other features with them?
Oh, yes. I'm sorry. Well, we were put under contract at Universal, and those were remarkable days. There are many people opposed to the studio system, but I think it was very beneficial for writers. And I wish they had worked out the inequities of the system and it still remained, because you were assigned a movie, you knew who the stars were, you wrote for them, you knew it was going to be made unless you screwed it up. And so what an enticing and inspiring atmosphere. So yes, we wrote Abbott and Costello and the Foreign Legion was our first movie for Abbott and Costello. Then they assigned us a Ma and Pa Kettle, and we did a script on they're going to New York called Ma and Pa to go to town. Then I think we did another Abbott and Costello. We did a second Ma and Pa Kettle at the fair. And then they assigned us to a Donald O'Connor movie. They wanted a plot for it. We developed a plot where Donald O'Connor was the milkman. And at that time, we had a dear friend, Phil Silvers, who was out of work. And nothing was happening for him. So we decided he would be Donald O'Connor's best friend in the movie. And we couldn't cast him as that, but we wrote the part for him. We described him as long and gangly, wearing dark glasses. We even were audacious enough to put some of his catchphrases in, such as "glad to see you." And we assured Phil he would get the part. And our assurance was meaningless. They cast Jimmy Durante. I don't know how or why. He certainly didn't fit on the scripted passages. But the narrative is seldom read in a movie.
Did the jokes work for him?
Oh, they changed the jokes. We changed the jokes. You couldn't do that. He couldn't be the aggressive personality. Jimmy was more placid, reactionary type of humor. Reaction, took precedent, yeah.
Before we completely leave Abbott and Costello, I want to talk about them both individually. Can you describe Bud Abbott for me personally and then professionally?
I will tell you something that is interesting historically. You may or may not know this. I didn't know it at the time. In burlesque, where Abbott and Girls came from, it was much harder to find a gifted straight man than a comedian. So the straight man was paid more than the comedian. And it was Bud Abbott who hired Lou Costello to work with him. And unfortunately, it wasn't a 50-50 relationship. And that inequity disturbed Costello, and in the later years, he reversed it so that he got more money than Bud, because on the television screen, it seemed like you don't need any specific straight man. You can replace them. Time we came along, Abbott and Costello were not as meticulous in their timing as they had been when we first started, when they first started. I don't think they liked each other. The relationship had soured. The joy of performing together dissipated. They played card games in which they actually tried to break each other and would reluctantly go to the set to perform. Lou was going through a series of identity crises then. I think he hated to be dependent upon the other. He wanted to do his own comedy. He would like to have been Buster Keaton or Charlie Chaplin. And ultimately, when they did split up, he went out on his own, and I worked with him on the Steve Allen show where I wrote and directed a sketch for him.
We'll pick that up on the next day.
Okay.
Interrupt you because we're ending on the first day.
Okay.